What's up everybody, and welcome back to this series. I'm Calvin Maclure. With the success of Gemini-X and the Saturn test flight program scoring perfect marks thus far, still fresh in the minds of all, invigorating their sense of purpose in every new mission, mission planners, engineers, and the crew of Gemini-XI had not so much received a go for what was to come next as much as a vote of confidence that the next mission, greater in scope, risk, and reward than anything previously attempted thus far, would succeed. Yet, for all its proven might, the Saturn was still early in its development. There was still uncertainty as to how well the unknowns were known. The J2 had performed so far, and the H1s were still in their early specifications and still lacked the full output the Saturn was intended to receive. For this mission, more power still would be needed. The addition of solid rocket boosters had already been considered during the design phases of the Saturn I. Accordingly then, the 8 added solid boosters were a surprise only to onlookers. With only a pair of test flights under its belt, but with the deadlines and targets coming and going just as fast as the agency could cope with, the most powerful version of the Saturn I was already tasked with its first mission. With the nature of the mission and its objectives what they were, Gemini-XI would be a 2-part mission, and only if every part of the first half were successful could the second half of the mission even think of launching.
First stage fuel tank is pressurized, and the second stage liquid oxygen tank pressurizing at this time. Now coming up on the 2-minute mark, T-minus 2 minutes on the communication circuits as everybody stands by monitoring the various consoles and watching the various parameters to ensure everything is okay. Condition the liquid oxygen in the first stage of the Saturn launch vehicle. All tanks in the 2 stages now pressurized. The test conductor, Don Carlson. 1 minute, 10 seconds and counting. We still are go at this time. 3-second mark in the countdown. T-minus 21 seconds and counting. We have completed our power transfer. The Saturn 1B launch vehicle, which now weighs 1.3 million pounds, is ready to go. Coming up on the 10-second mark. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, we have ignition.
right on schedule for only the third time in its short existence. The agency's most powerful rocket launched and set out to reach for the stars. As if the noise and vibrations emanating from the venerable beast, competing with even the fiercest of thunders, wasn't enough. The 8 extra solid rocket motors only added to the unparalleled bravado. As ground crews monitored the streams of telemetry highlighting the rocket's vitals and trajectory, going through a sequence of pre-planned and timed events they had rehearsed again and again and again, as it was soaring ever higher, faster and farther, the Saturn was hitting its every mark along the way, with no intervention whatsoever. As it reached max Q, transonic speeds followed by Mach 1, it showed no signs of fatigue nor any signs of letting off from the mission with which it had been so very dearly entrusted. The 9 H1 engines that powered the first stage all showed healthy vital signs, including chamber pressures, pump speeds, as well as fuel and oxidizer burn rates. But if all had gone according to plan thus far, and tensions inside mission control had eased, as the time for the stage separation and J2 ignition drew near, tensions and heart rates began to grow again. If the J2 failed to ignite, the entire mission of Gemini-XI would be lost. With the successful start of the second stage and jettison of the massive payload fairings, all that was now left was for the massive S4B upper stage to finish its course to orbit. Just as it had done before on its 2 test flights, the massive Hydrolox J2 continued to burn through its fuel reserves with optimal performance. And as for the massive S4B upper stage, it continued on its course, steadfast, resolute, and with pinpoint accuracy. With the first half of the Gemini-XI mission now complete, the rocket and its payload successfully placed in a parking orbit, engineers immediately made sure the massive upper stage had entered into safe mode and that it was in a stable condition with minimal oscillations. For by the time the crew of Gemini-XI reached it, it would have gone completely silent. Mission controllers for this part of the journey back on the ground could now rest, their contributions now being complete. But as for the rest of the ground crews, their journey had only just begun.
Houston, you're go for 203. Suitable right 2 degrees. Joe, when you get a chance, maybe left about 2 degrees. Okay, Houston, we're from the PPI. Here we see the cabin increasing, looking good. 10 seconds.
As the sun rose slowly in the Florida skies overlooking the Cape, a familiar silhouette, warmed by the same sun that illuminated it, and one that had now become synonymous with Kerbal Kind's most daring and bold feats, emerged slowly from the darkness. Sitting atop the mighty triple-core Titan booster was the tiny 2-seater capsule that would be the home of the crew of Gemini-XI over the next several days. To ensure minimal losses, the crewed portion of the Gemini-XI mission would wait until its launch point intersected the path of the already orbiting S4B of Gemini-XIa. Not until that point would the engines ignite.
10 seconds. 3, 1, ready.
Right on time and right on target, the crew of Gemini-XI roared off the pad, on course for a rendezvous with the precious payload that awaited them beyond the surly bonds of Earth. Should the mighty Titan booster fail at any point, there would be no mission. Should the crew fail to rendezvous and dock with the S-4B already in orbit, the mission also would be lost. But for now, the Titan stayed true to the cause, true to its purpose, and true to the mission. The crew of Gemini-XI was on its way. With all three outer cores depleted of their fuel reserves, the Titan jettisoned the unnecessary weight, growing ever lighter as the launch continued, and now weighing less than a third of what it did less than 4 minutes ago. As the flight progressed and staging event after staging event was executed by both crew and machine, as though a perfect rendition of the play that had been written for it as told by only the greatest of storytellers, the exhilaration of drawing ever nearer to the goal set out for the mission became increasingly tangible to all. Adrenaline would flow through the veins of those whose hearts would race steadily more from ever-growing excitement as every subsequent unfolding event on the busy timeline led them closer and closer to the prize. The mighty Titan rocket, Old Faithful as it had now come to be known, continued to serve ever faithfully, as did Centaur in providing the final push into orbit that the crew and mission of Gemini-XI-B needed. With the thundering roar of the initial moments of launch over, Brewer and Scott now enjoyed the gentle and light push of the twin RL-10 engines of the Centaur, a fitting end to what had been thus far a completely flawless launch. Finally, the last 200 meters per second or so required came courtesy of the trans stage, the first time it performed in a mission with crew aboard. No sooner did Brewer and Scott celebrate their arrivals into Earth orbit did preparatory works begin for the next phase. First on the list were a series of system vital checks throughout the spacecraft. In fact, mission rules stated that only a clean bill of health by both crew and spacecraft could permit the mission to continue. And as systems checks, one by one, all came back bearing good news. Phase 2 would involve executing the necessary steps to fine-tune the orbit to catch up and rendezvous with the Saturn upper stage that had been since placed into orbit a little over a day. Since the launch of the Saturn, and up to and throughout the launch of the crew of Gemini-XI, the mighty beast of burden of the Saturn had been tracked with pinpoint precision. The crew of 11 would have to execute perfectly were they to succeed in rendezvousing with the upper stage on time. As the crew maintained a gentle vigilance over all system vitals, checklists, and timelines, orbit after orbit would meet sunrise after sunset, again and again, as the slow creep to the Saturn unfolded. Finally, after about a 2-day slow creep out to the Saturn, the massive upper stage, their target, even at a great distance as the sun flared over it, was in sight. When the two spacecraft finally did meet, the tiny little two-seater spacecraft of the Gemini and the 6-meter wide S4B, the Saturn upper stage absolutely dwarfed the Gemini in comparison. One could hardly believe we had come such a long way when just a little while ago, putting just a few kilos into orbit required the very best. Though ground controllers could see that no life really remained in the Saturn, nevertheless, Brewster and Scott would begin by performing a visual inspection of the craft they were to shortly dock with. The hope was that if any damage had been sustained by the Saturn or its payload during ascent, or even during its short stay on orbit as it waited to be met by the crew of 11, Brewster and Scott, peering through the small windows of their spacecraft, would be able to notice it. If anything out of the ordinary was noticed, ground crews would then deliberate on whether or not it was safe to continue. But as it so happened, no such damage occurred, and no such deliberations were necessary. The two crafts looked like two creatures, each looking the other down, studying one another, knowing one another. When the algo finally came, Brewer moved in on the docking port, perched atop the Saturn. When both crafts had been joined, it was the little Gemini that would, through a few basic electrical connectors, supply the necessary power to release the locking mechanism that up to this point had held the precious transstage payload safely in its place. With a few short bursts, the transstage was free, now mated to the Gemini. With the retrieval of the transstage now complete, Scott having confirmed the successful latching of the transfer stage, everyone back on Earth now sensed that the mission of Gemini-XI could truly begin. Back on the ground, the flight director and all of his controllers at Mission Control checked and rechecked checklists, as did the crew, and everyone prepared and crossed their fingers for the next major milestone to come. With the call from Houston coming in, with palpable excitation and Swiss-like precision, the twin engine of the transstage fired up, burning until nothing was left, helping to increase the speed of the Gemini to well beyond its initial value. In the spacecraft, the crew could only ascertain the basics of how the transstage was operating. Most of the telemetry was beamed down through the Gemini's comm systems. As the first of a planned 2-burn TLA continued, Mission Control updated the crew on the progress and success of this first burn. Depleted of all its fuel and oxidizer reserves, its part in the mission over, its place in history secured, the first of the 2 transstages was released and let to wander along its way. In order to break free from the pull of Earth's gravity, the burden of responsibility would fall to the second transstage to complete the task hitherto and beyond. As everyone watched and waited and prayed for another healthy transstage, second by second, the mission clock ticked down to the moment of the second TLI ignition. Back on the ground, the engineers who had been responsible for bringing to maturity the upper stage at long last could taste the sweetness of their hard labors. Much like the first strand stage had done, the second kick stage executed flawlessly. Not a single byte of data suggested that at any point in time had there been any undesirable behaviors. No longer needed, the second trans stage that had been mated to the Gemini over the past several weeks was released from its bonds and let to drift in the vacuum of space. As quickly as they had come into play, their contributions to the mission were over, and with it, the crew of Gemini-XI was moonbound. Though they were not the first to do so, they would, however, be the first to attempt manned lunar orbit. After a roughly 5-day trip there, Gemini-XI had arrived, right on target and right on time, the tiny spacecraft now dwarfed by something much bigger than the Saturn. For the crew, their view outside their tiny windows now overwhelming their senses, one could easily understand how the historic and monumental task that was to follow seemed, at least for the moment, to be inconsequential. But again, reaping the hard-earned fruits of their labors, the AJ-10, now the solitary power plant aboard, ignited, and at once the spacecraft started decelerating. It was the first time since departing the vicinity of the Earth that the astronauts had felt the effects of acceleration on their bodies. The stopping power of the AJ-10 had lulled them out of the comforts of zero-G and thrust them into their seatbelts until, all at once, it was over. Under the eerie calmness of the lunar expanse below them, the slow, gentle, and subtle pace of lunar orbit before them, the glow of lunar light filling their tiny spacecraft with an almost mystical aura, Brewster and Scott could hardly take it all in. As they busied themselves with photography of targets of interest, as well as validating one's ability to identify specific landmarks from lunar orbit, amongst other things, the crew of Gemini-XI found themselves continually lured away from their busy schedules. Truly, the moon was a powerful mistress whose allure one could hardly resist. The crew of 2 would stay in orbit for up to 5 hours, after which time duty, home, and hearth would beckon again. Of all the events that had preceded, none mattered more than this one. Failure here would mean there would be no home to go back to. To the relief of all, the lone AJ-10, the sole means of getting back home, ignited on its very first attempt. With fuel reserves well within margins, everyone waited for the confirmation of a successful burn. They had done it. The crew had done it. Mission Control had done it. The people, technicians, mechanics, and engineers behind the hardware had done it. The small 2-seater capsule that had never initially been planned for any mission beyond the vicinity of Earth had done it. After all of the pitfalls and struggles during its developmental stages, the little engine that could, now a part of history, that had successfully sent the crew of Gemini-XI beyond the grip of Earth's gravity, had done it. It had fired on time, every time, and for the duration that had been asked of it. What at one point had seemed like the chink in the armor, now placed, for the first time ever, a crew into lunar orbit and had got them back on course for their journey back home. But the mission was far from over. There still lay ahead of them the traverse that had for so long been at the same time the great divide that separated the Earth from the Moon, and the doorway to a world of mystery, legend, and awe. For now at least, all could be at ease. Gemini-XI was coming home. Its task now complete, and its mission over, with the crew undocked from the lunar propulsion unit and bid their farewells, forever indebted to the unsung hero of the mission. In just a few moments' time, Brewer and Scott would once again feel the pull of Earth's gravity as their tiny little spacecraft, trapped in a raging inferno, would begin to pierce through the atmosphere at breakneck speeds. These short few moments would be theirs and theirs only to experience, as those back on Earth would be temporarily cut off during the blackout period. After both the drogue and main had successfully deployed, and now just a few moments remained between now and the official end of the mission, the crew of Gemini-XI would take advantage of this final serene moment to think back on what had just transpired, of what they had achieved, on what they had seen. When they would finally exit their craft, they would think on how this tiny little spacecraft had carried them to the moon and back without so much as a hiccup along the way. Upon their safe return home, they were greeted as heroes. They would be the ones who, for now, would carry the torch of the hopes and dreams of all for a better tomorrow. That's going to do it for this episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already done so, please be sure to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel to grow. And let me know what your thoughts on the episode are. If you'd like to find out how you can support the channel in a special way, be sure to go and check out the Calvin Maclure Patreon page. Patrons get special access and privileges for their contributions. Be sure also to stop by the Calvin Maclure Discord and come be a part of the experience there. Thanks to everyone for your continued support. I'm Calvin Maclure, and I'll see you next time.